They sold him a too fat bride as a cruel joke. Lonely rancher made her his world. The dust swirled with a malicious glee, mirroring the twisted amusement in the eyes of the crowd. It caked worn dress, clung to her tear-streaked face, a gritty shroud for her public shame. On a makeshift platform, normally reserved for livestock or foreclosed property, she stood, head bowed, the weight of 100 leering gazes pressing down on her like a physical blow. Jeremiah Thorne, a man whose girth was matched only by his cruelty, his voice a greasy rasp, gestured towards her with a flourish. "Gentlemen, a rare offering today. Perhaps not what some of you are accustomed to, but ample, shall we say." A wave of coarse laughter rippled through the assembled men, each guffaw another nail in Ariel's already crucified dignity. Her supposed crime? To be an orphan, indebted, and in their narrow estimation, too fat for any respectable man's consideration. Thorne had bought her debt for a pittance, and this charade was his idea of sport. A public gesture to solidify his petty tyranny over the small, struggling settlement of Redemption Gulch. Ariel's hands clenched at her sides until her knuckles were white, the only outward sign of the inferno of humiliation raging within her. She dared not look up, dared not meet their eyes, for fear the last vestiges of her strength would crumble in the suffocating silence that followed the laughter, broken only by Thorne's satisfied chuckle. A new voice cut through the oppressive air, calm and low, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "How much?" All eyes swiveled. Silas Blackwood stood at the edge of the crowd, a figure as weathered and unyielding as the granite bluffs that overlooked his isolated ranch. He was a man of few words and fewer companions. His face, a roadmap of sun-etched lines and unspoken sorrows, his eyes the color of a winter sky, held no amusement, only a deep, unsettling stillness. Thorne, momentarily surprised, recovered with a smirk. "Well, Blackwood, didn't figure you for the marrying kind. Or perhaps you're just looking for extra winter insulation." More laughter, but this time it was tinged with a nervous uncertainty. Silas was not a man to be trifled with. His quietude, often mistaken for passivity, but those who had crossed him knew the steel beneath. Silas's gaze didn't flicker from Ariel. He saw not the caricature Thorne presented, but the tremor in her shoulders, the glint of unshed tears on her lashes, the raw pain etched around her mouth. He saw a soul drowning, and the waters were rising fast. His voice, when it came again, was flat, devoid of emotion. "Name your price, Thorne, for her debt." Thorne, enjoying his power, stroked his chin. "For you, Blackwood, considering her unique attributes, let's say $50, a bargain for so much woman." The sneer was palpable. Silas reached into his worn leather pouch, his movements deliberate. The clink of coins dropping onto Thorne's outstretched palm sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden hush. He didn't count them. He just met Thorne's greedy eyes. "She's free of you," Silas stated, not asked. He then looked at Ariel, his expression unreadable. "You'll come with me." It was an offer, a command, a lifeline all in one. Ariel, stunned, finally lifted her head, her gaze locking with his. In his eyes, she saw not derision, not pity, but something she hadn't encountered in what felt like an eternity. A flicker of res, perhaps just an absence of the cruelty she had come to expect. What choice did she have? Stay here to be further tormented? She nodded, a barely perceptible movement, her throat too tight for words. The long ride to Silas Blackwood's ranch was a study in silence, a heavy blanket woven with unspoken questions and lingering fear. Ariel sat hunched on the spare mare he provided, her body aching from the tension of the auction, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. Who was this man, this quiet, somber rancher, who had plucked her from public humiliation with a handful of coins and a few terse words? Was this another form of captivity, a different cage? The landscape grew harsher, more desolate, mirroring the landscape of her own heart. The barn, when they finally reached it, was a testament to a solitary existence. A small, sturdy cabin, a well-kept barn, and corral stood starkly against the vast, unforgiving plains. There were no feminine touches, no signs of comfort beyond the purely functional. Silas dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He offered a hand to help her down, his touch surprisingly gentle, calloused, yet careful. "The cabin's there," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Food's in the pantry, bed's made. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his attention seemingly on unsaddling the horses. Ariel hesitated, her feet rooted to the dusty ground. "Mr. Blackwood, why?" The question, barely a whisper, hung in the air between them. Silas paused, his back still to her for a long moment. The only sound was the sigh of the wind through the eaves of the barn. Then he turned, his face unreadable in the fading light. "No one deserves to be paraded." His voice was low, rough, as if the words themselves were an effort. He met her gaze briefly, a fleeting connection that spoke volumes more than his sparse words. "You're safe here. Rest." He then led the horses towards the barn, leaving Ariel standing alone, a maelstrom of emotions churning within her. Safety. It was a foreign concept. She entered the cabin cautiously. It was clean, Spartan, a single bed in one corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace cold and empty. It was the home of a man who expected little from life, and perhaps received even less. That night, she lay in the narrow bed, every nerve-ending raw, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the plains, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak of the cabin settling. Sleep was elusive, chased away by shadows of the past and anxieties about the future. What did he want from her? What price would she eventually have to pay for this unexpected sanctuary? She thought of Thorne's leering face, the crowd's cruel laughter, and a fresh wave of shame washed over her. But then she remembered Silas's eyes, not kind, not yet, but steady and devoid of the malice that had become her daily bread. It was a sliver of light in an overwhelming darkness, and she clung to it with the desperation of a drowning woman. She was a burden, she knew, another mouth to feed, a reminder of a transaction born of pity or some inscrutable motive. But as days turned into a week, Silas asked nothing of her. He rose before dawn, worked his land with a tireless, almost penitent energy, and returned after dusk, weary and silent. He ate his meals with a stoic indifference, his gaze often fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls, a place only he could see. He left her to her own devices, offering a pact, strange, unspoken respect for her space, her grief. Slowly, tentatively, Ariel began to emerge from her shell of fear. The constant gnawing hunger of her previous life was replaced by the simple, sustaining food Silas provided. She started by tidying the small cabin, a way to repay his tacit kindness, to feel useful. She mended his worn shirts, the needle of familiar comfort in her hands. She found a neglected patch of ground near the cabin, and with a rusty hoe Silas hadn't used in years, began to coax life from the stubborn soil. He watched her sometimes from a distance, his expression unreadable. Did he approve? Disapprove? He said nothing, but one evening he left a small pouch of seeds on the table. Beans, squash, corn. No words, just the seeds. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared purpose, however small. Ariel's heart felt a flutter, a fragile thing, like the first green shoots peeking through the earth. She began to notice the small details about him, the way his hands, though rough and calloused, were surprisingly deft when mending a fence or tending a lame calf. The deep sadness that sometimes settled in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The worn silver locket he always wore, tucked beneath his shirt, a secret he never spoke of. One afternoon, while cleaning, she found a small dust-covered wooden box tucked away on a high shelf. Hesitantly, she opened it. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and beside it, a child's scrawled drawing of a stick-figure family beneath a lopsided sun. A wave of understanding, sharp and painful, washed over Ariel. This was his haunted past, the source of the profound sorrow that clung to him like a second skin. He had known loss, a loss so deep it had carved canyons into his soul. She closed the box, a new aching empathy blooming in her chest. He wasn't just a stoic protector. He was a man wounded, perhaps irreparably. The news of Silas Blackwood's purchase had, of course, rippled through Redemption Gulch, providing endless fodder for gossip and speculation. Jedediah Thorne in particular felt a simmering resentment. Blackwood had not only interfered with his cruel entertainment, but had, by his quiet defiance, subtly undermined Thorne's perceived authority. Thorne was a man who thrived on the fear and compliance of others. Silas's indifference was an affront. He began to make his displeasure known in small, insidious ways. He'd accidentally short Silas on supplies at the general store he owned, or spread rumors that Blackwood was unstable, perhaps even dangerous, for taking in damaged goods. The townsfolk, a largely cowardly assembly eager to avoid Thorn's eye, mostly kept their distance from Silas, and by extension, Ariel. When she rarely accompanied him to town for necessities, their whispers followed her like shadows, their averted gazes a constant reminder of her perceived shame. But Ariel, bolstered by Silas's silent strength and her own growing resilience, found she cared less and less for their opinions. She had a purpose now, however small, tending her garden, managing the modest household, offering a quiet companionship that Silas, to her surprise, seemed to subtly accept. One sweltering afternoon, as Silas was mending a corral fence, Thorn rode out to the barn, flanked by two of his thuggish lackeys. He reined in his horse, his piggish eyes raking over Ariel, who was tending her now flourishing, strange, unspoken respect for her space, her grief. Slowly, tentatively, Emily began to emerge from her shell of fear. The constant gnawing hunger of her previous life was replaced by the simple, sustaining food Jack provided. She started by tidying the small cabin, a way to repay his tacit kindness, to feel useful. She mended his worn shirts, the needle of familiar comfort in her hands. She found a neglected patch of ground near the cabin, and with a rusty hoe Jack hadn't used in years, began to coax life from the stubborn soil. He watched her sometimes from a distance, his expression unreadable. Did he approve? Disapprove? He said nothing, but one evening he left a small pouch of seeds on the table. Beans, squash, corn. No words, just the seeds. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared purpose, however small. Emily's heart felt a flutter, a fragile thing, like the first green shoots peeking through the earth. She began to notice the small details about him, the way his hands, though rough and calloused, were surprisingly deft when mending a fence or tending a lame calf. The deep sadness that sometimes settled in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The worn silver locket he always wore, tucked beneath his shirt, a secret he never spoke of. One afternoon, while cleaning, she found a small dust-covered wooden box tucked away on a high shelf. Hesitantly, she opened it. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and beside it, a child's scrawled drawing of a stick-figure family beneath a lopsided sun. A wave of understanding, sharp and painful, washed over Emily. This was his haunted past, the source of the profound sorrow that clung to him like a second skin. He had known loss, a loss so deep it had carved canyons into his soul. She closed the box, a new aching empathy blooming in her chest. He wasn't just a stoic protector. He was a man wounded, perhaps irreparably. The news of Jack Blackwood's purchase had, of course, rippled through Redemption Gulch, providing endless fodder for gossip and speculation. Jameson Thorne in particular felt a simmering resentment. Blackwood had not only interfered with his cruel entertainment, but had, by his quiet defiance, subtly undermined Thorne's perceived authority. Thorne was a man who thrived on the fear and compliance of others. Jack's indifference was an affront. He began to make his displeasure known in small, insidious ways. He'd accidentally short Jack on supplies at the general store he owned, or spread rumors that Blackwood was unstable, perhaps even dangerous, for taking in damaged goods. The townsfolk, a largely cowardly assembly eager to avoid Jameson's eye, mostly kept their distance from Jack, and by extension, Emily. When she rarely accompanied him to town for necessities, their whispers followed her like shadows, their averted gazes a constant reminder of her perceived shame. But Emily, bolstered by Jack's silent strength and her own growing resilience, found she cared less and less for their opinions. She had a purpose now, however small, tending her garden, managing the modest household, offering a quiet companionship that Jack, to her surprise, seemed to subtly accept. One sweltering afternoon, as Jack was mending a corral fence, Jameson rode out to the barn, flanked by two of his thuggish lackeys. He reined in his horse, his piggish eyes raking over Emily, who was tending her now flourishing, leveling the gun. Emily screamed a wordless cry of terror, not for herself, but for Jack. She lunged forward, grabbing a heavy garden hoe, her only thought to protect the man who had shown her a dignity no one else would. But Jack was faster. He charged Jameson, not with blind rage, but with chilling precision. He ducked under the wavering pistol, his shoulder crashing into Jameson's ample midsection. The shot went wild, thudding into the barn wall. The pistol clattered to the ground. Jack didn't stop. His fists, hardened by years of labor and grief, found their mark again and again. It wasn't a brawler's wild swinging. It was the targeted, efficient dismantling of a bully, fueled by a lifetime of pent-up sorrow and a newly reawakened sense of justice. Jameson, no match for this avenging fury, crumpled, gasping and bloody. The remaining lackey, witnessing his boss's utter demolition, wasted no time. He wheeled his horse and fled, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Jack stood over Jameson, chest heaving, his face a mask of grim satisfaction and profound exhaustion. He was breathing hard, the fire in his eyes slowly banking, replaced by a deep, weary ache. He looked at Emily, who stood frozen, the hoe still clutched in her trembling hands, her face streaked with dust and tears. He saw her fear, her courage, and something else, a fierce protective loyalty that mirrored his own. Just then, a rider approached, not with the haste of Jameson's fleeing man, but with a steady, official pace. Sheriff Brody, his face grim, had heard the gunshot from the main road. He took in the scene, Jameson blubbering on the ground, the injured lackey groaning nearby, Jack standing resolute, and Emily, a silent, shaken sentinel. "Jack," Brody said, his voice tired, "what in damnation happened here?" Jack gestured towards Jameson with the hammer, which he still held, though loosely now. "He came to my land, threatened us. He won't be doing it again." Jameson, seeing the law, began to whine. "He attacked me, Sheriff, unprovoked, tried to kill me." Sheriff Brody looked from Jameson's blustering, bruised face to Jack's stony, righteous countenance, then to Emily, whose wide, honest eyes held a truth Jameson's never could. Brody had known Jack Blackwood for years. He knew his quiet nature, knew the whispers of his past tragedy. He also knew Jameson Thorne for the overbearing, cruel man he was. His conscience, often weary, stirred. "Jameson," Brody said, dismounting slowly, his gaze hardening. "I heard you were out this way looking for trouble. Looks like you found it." He glanced at the pistol lying in the dust. "And it looks like Jack here just finished it." He nudged Jameson with his boot. "Get up. You're coming with me. Disturbing the peace, assault. Looks like we'll sort it out in town." As Brody hauled a protesting Jameson to his feet and secured his prisoner, Jack finally let the hammer drop. The sound of it hitting the earth was like an exhalation, a release of burdens long carried. He swayed slightly, and Emily rushed to his side, her earlier fear replaced by a surge of concern. "Jack, are you hurt?" He looked down at her, a faint, almost imperceptible softening around his mouth. "Just tired, Emily. Just tired." His hand came up briefly to touch her arm, a gesture of reassurance, of shared victory. The world he had built around his grief, a fortress of solitude, had been breached, not by an enemy, but by an unlikely ally. A woman deemed worthless by the world, but who, in his eyes, had become precious. The dust settled, literally and metaphorically. Sheriff Brody, after taking statements and ensuring Jack wasn't grievously injured, departed with Jameson and his whimpering associate in tow. Redemption Gulch would buzz with this new tale for weeks, but the power dynamic had subtly shifted. A bully had been faced down, not by force of numbers, but by the quiet courage of one man and the resilience of one woman. Emily gently cleaned the cuts and bruises on Jack's face and hands, her touch light, her concern palpable. The small cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, felt different now, imbued with a shared experience, a shared triumph. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken anxieties, but filled with a comfortable, emerging understanding. "He won't bother you again," Jack said, his voice raspy. He looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time, without the shadow of his past looming so large. He saw her strength, her quiet dignity, the kindness in her eyes that had not been extinguished by cruelty. Emily met his gaze, a small tentative smile gracing her lips. "You saved me, Jack." He shook his head slowly. "We saved each other, Emily." And in that simple statement, a profound truth resonated. He had offered her sanctuary, and she, in turn, had offered him a reason to fight, a reason to live beyond the ghosts of his past. The hole in his heart, carved by loss, would never fully mend, but Emily's presence was like sunshine on barren ground, coaxing new life, new hope. The desolate ranch, once a monument to his sorrow, began to transform. Emily's garden thrived, bringing color and sustenance. Her quiet laughter, a sound rarely heard at first, began to echo in the small cabin, chasing away the lingering shadows. She brought a sense of order, of gentle care, not just to the physical space, but to the fractured pieces of Jack's spirit. He still wore the locket, but now when he touched it, it wasn't just with sorrow, but with a sense of peace, as if his lost loved ones could rest easier, knowing he was no longer entirely alone, no longer consumed by grief. He had honored their memory, not by withdrawing from the world, but by re-engaging with it, by protecting another soul from the harshness he knew too well. He had seen past the cruel jests, past the whispers and the scorn heaped upon Emily. He had looked beyond the superficial judgment of a callous society and recognized a spirit of immense worth, a heart capable of profound courage and deep affection. He had been sold a bride as a cruel joke, but in Emily, Jack Blackwood found not a burden, but his whole world, a world reborn from ashes, a world filled with the quiet promise of a shared future. Their life was not one of grand pronouncements or passionate displays, but of small, steady acts of kindness, of shared labor under the vast prairie sky, of a companionship forged in adversity and tempered by respect. The lonely rancher, haunted by his past, had found redemption, not in forgetting, but in opening his heart to new beginnings, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, love and hope, in their most unadorned forms, could blossom. What would you have done in Jack's place when society casts someone aside, when laughter is used as a weapon? Do you join the chorus, or do you seek the humanity hidden beneath the pain? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story of courage and redemption touched your heart, be sure to like, subscribe, and click here to watch another tale of the human spirit triumphing in the unforgiving West.